Chapter 1. The Farmer's Curse, Toil, Blisters, and Broken Backs. For most of human history, farming wasn't a profession, it was a prison sentence inherited at birth. If you were born into a family of farmers, you didn't aspire to anything else. You didn't apprentice, apply, or train. You were handed a crude tool, pointed toward a patch of earth, and told to get to work. For millennia, farmers were the backbone of every society, yet the weight they carried was unrelenting, and the thanks they received was almost non-existent. The life of a farmer began before sunrise. There were no alarms, but also no rest. Sleep was fragmented, disrupted by cold, noise, livestock, or infants. As dawn broke, the farmer's body already ached from yesterday's labors. Chickens needed feeding, cows needed milking, goats needed herding, and none of those creatures cared if you had slept at all. Work began when the sky brightened and ended only when darkness made it impossible to see. Across ancient civilizations, from the wheat fields of Mesopotamia to the rice terraces of China, the maize plots of Mesoamerica to the barley plains of the Nile Valley, the farmer's tools were primitive. Wooden plows, often pulled by oxen if available, tore stubborn soil. If oxen weren't available, the job was done by hand or shared among family members. Sowing seeds wasn't a simple sprinkle. It had to be done with precision. If seeds were too close, the crops would suffocate one another. Too far apart, and weeds would fill the gaps. The days blurred together in labor, weeding, watering, carrying heavy loads of grain, baskets of manure, bundles of firewood. The sun was brutal in summer and absent in winter. Farmers worked in every weather: pouring rain, stifling heat, frost, wind. There was no option to pause. Crops didn't wait. They died. Food insecurity was cruel irony. The people who produced the food often went hungry. Most farming societies demanded tribute, taxes to kings, offerings to temples, dues to landlords. What remained was stored in clay pots, wooden bins, or underground caches. A cracked seal, a wet sack, or a rodent could mean the loss of a family's winter supply. And if food ran out, there was no backup plan. Diseases were common and merciless. Waterborne parasites from contaminated rivers caused diarrhea and organ failure. Soil infections led to fevers, sepsis, and death. Cuts from tools could become infected. In hot climates, exposure to the sun caused blisters, dehydration, and skin cancers. In colder areas, frostbite and respiratory illness claimed the weak. And all of it happened without medicine, anesthetics, or reliable midwives. Women bore the dual burden of labor and childbirth. They worked in the fields, carried water, prepared meals, tended livestock, spun wool, mended clothing, raised children, and then gave birth in smoke-filled huts with no sterile tools, no sanitation, and no help beyond the hands of other untrained women. Many died in labor. Others died from complications soon after. Still, the world expected them to keep working. Children had no childhoods. By the time they were 6, they were given tasks: scaring birds from fields, carrying water, gathering sticks, helping plant seeds. By 10, they worked full days beside adults. Play was rare and usually revolved around learning future labor, skills. Education was only for the elite. For farming families, learning to read was useless. Learning to survive, that was everything. Religion dictated even more rules. Bad harvest, the gods must be angry. Drought, You didn't pray hard enough. Flood? Someone must have sinned. Farmers were responsible not just for crops, but for community blessings. They brought the first fruits to temples, offered animals they could barely afford to spare, and followed sacred calendars that determined when and how to plant. Violating religious farming customs wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you exiled, punished, or worse. Festivals celebrating the harvest may seem joyful to modern eyes, but they were often more burden than blessing. The best food went to the temple or the nobility. Farmers cooked for others while eating the scraps. They built the festival structures, prepared the firewood, brewed the drinks, and cleaned the messes. Celebrating meant even more work. And then there were disasters. A single storm could destroy an entire year's effort. Hail, drought, wildfires, swarms of locusts. These weren't occasional, they were frequent. Entire villages could face starvation. Sometimes farmers buried seeds rather than eat them, hoping next year might be better. Sometimes they didn't live to see that year. In many places, the land didn't belong to the farmers who worked it. In feudal Europe, serfs worked estates owned by lords and had to ask permission to marry, travel, or hunt. In ancient Egypt, much of the land was temple-owned. In China, heavy grain taxes fed bureaucrats and soldiers, while the farmers lived on thin porridge. In Mesoamerica, farmers served both their village and their overlords, building roads or serving in military labor when demanded. And if war came, farmers suffered first. Soldiers trampled crops, burned storehouses, and seized livestock. Food shortages led to disease outbreaks. Those who survived the army often faced famines afterward. Some were conscripted to fight, others were taken as slaves. Recovery could take years, if recovery came at all. The farmer's home was rarely a place of comfort, a single-room structure often shared with animals. Dirt floors, smoke-blackened ceilings. No glass windows, no insulation, no clean water supply. Bathing happened rarely, often in cold, stagnant ponds. Lice and fleas were common. Bedding was straw, stuffed into sacks, shared among several people. Privacy was a concept only the wealthy could afford. Retirement didn't exist. You worked until you couldn't stand. Then your children took over, and if you didn't have children, you withered. Elders might be respected in word, but physically they were liabilities. In hard years, the elderly often volunteered to eat, less or not at all. Some cultures saw leaving for the mountain or disappearing quietly as an honorable way to die. When death came, there was no great mourning, no pyramids, no monuments, maybe a wooden marker soon swallowed by rain and wind. Most farmers' names were never written down. Their lives were passed along only through oral stories, stories that rarely lasted more than a generation or two. The monuments they left were not made of stone. They were the fields that fed the cities, the granaries that fed the kings, and the labor that fed history itself. Because everything depended on them. The soldier needed bread, the priest needed offerings, the merchant needed surplus, the philosopher needed leisure, the builder needed fuel, the emperor needed tax. The farmer supplied it all. So the next time you see a painting of rolling hills, a peasant with a sickle, a tranquil field in the sunshine, know that you're looking at a battlefield, not of swords or arrows, but of sweat, sunburn, starvation, and sacrifice. The ancient farmer fought every day. and every day most of them lost a little more. They worked in silence. They died in silence. But without them, history would have had no voice at all. Chapter 2. The Builder's Burden, Bricks, Blisters, and Broken Bones. In the ancient world, monuments were meant to last forever. Massive pyramids, colossal temples, fortified walls, and glittering palaces, these were the symbols of kings, gods, and empires. But while history remembers the architects, emperors, and deities that demanded them, it forgets the men who built them. The builders, the laborers, the hands that stacked the stones, mixed the mortar, and bled into the ground so that others could leave behind greatness. To be a builder in the ancient world was to live a life of strain and danger. The job required strength, endurance, precision, and above all, obedience. Builders were often at the bottom of the social ladder, peasants, conscripts, slaves, or prisoners of war. They had no say in what they built, how they were treated, or whether they survived. They existed to carry weight, to follow orders, and to make sure the project didn't collapse, at least until they did. Construction sites were not places of safety. They were open-air hazards filled with sharp tools, heavy materials, collapsing scaffolds, and screaming overseers. There were no hard hats, no steel-toed boots, no harnesses, no laws to protect workers. If you slipped, you fell. If a stone cracked, you carried it anyway. If a beam broke, you ducked, or didn't. Injury was expected. Death was not uncommon. The materials themselves were unforgiving. Massive limestone blocks for pyramids, volcanic rock for temples, mud bricks for homes, timber beams that required entire teams to lift, mortar made from lime that burned the skin. Tools were basic: bronze chisels, wooden levers, rope pulleys, stone hammers. These tools wore down, shattered, or snapped mid-use, sending shards into eyes, limbs, or nearby workers. There were no gloves, no eyewear. You learned quickly or didn't last. In ancient Egypt, workers built tombs and temples in unbearable heat. They chiseled into cliffs, dragged stone across sand, and climbed rickety ladders with arms full of tools. Their backs bore the weight of civilization, literally. In Mesopotamia, laborers shaped ziggurats by hauling thousands of baked bricks, one by one, in temperatures that could rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In Rome, men built aqueducts that stretched across valleys, bridges that stood for centuries, and arenas that demanded both architectural genius and mountains of muscle. The cost was enormous, not in gold but in human lives. Work began at dawn, if not earlier. Builders were divided into teams, each with specific responsibilities. Some cut stone, others carried it. Some mixed mortar in giant pits with bare feet, while others hauled water from nearby wells. Supervisors barked orders, scribes documented progress, delays were punished, injuries were ignored. Your task was not to be comfortable. It was to produce. The soundscape of ancient construction was chaos: grinding stone, cracking timber, shouted commands, grunts of strain, and the constant thud of impact. Dust filled the air, coating lungs and blinding eyes. Thirst came quickly. Water was rationed. Shade was rare. The sun scorched uncovered backs, and in colder regions, wind cut through cloth and skin. Clothing was minimal: tunics, loincloths, or nothing at all. The goal was not appearance, it was function. Nutrition was poor. Rations often consisted of bread, onions and beer or water. Meals were rushed, breaks were few. A sick worker was a slow worker, and slow workers were either dismissed or disciplined. In some cultures, especially where forced labor was common, discipline meant flogging, starvation, or even death. In Mesoamerica, workers built temples without metal tools or beasts of burden. Everything was done by hand. Stones were shaped with obsidian blades, moved with ropes, lifted with wooden ramps. The work was so strenuous that builders had special calluses named after them, deep, thick pads on shoulders, feet, and hands. Even in cultures that did not use slaves, the line between free labor and expendable was often thin. Women and children were sometimes involved as well, not necessarily in the heavy lifting, but in mixing materials, gathering supplies, or preparing food for labor crews. In some societies, particularly under desperate conditions, whole families would be drafted into the workforce. Children carried buckets, mothers fetched water, fathers hauled beams. The dead were rarely honored. If a worker died on the job, he was usually buried nearby in an unmarked grave. In some regions, his name might be recorded. In others, he simply vanished from the project roster. The monument rose while the worker was forgotten. His contribution remained invisible, trapped between the stones he helped raise. Some workers developed lifelong disabilities, crushed toes, ruined backs, mangled fingers, blindness from flying debris. There were no pensions, no compensation. A disabled worker was a burden. He might be supported by his family if they were able, or he might be left to beg at the city gate. Builders broke their bodies to raise buildings that would stand for millennia, long after their own bones had turned to dust. The builders of the Great Wall of China suffered perhaps more than most. Stretching thousands of miles, the wall demanded constant labor in rugged terrain. Workers slept on site in caves or tents. Many died from falls, exposure, malnutrition, or beatings. So many bodies were buried under the wall that it became known as the world's longest graveyard. The irony: most of the laborers weren't building it to protect their families. They were doing it because they were told to. But there was pride too, though rarely rewarded. Some workers knew what they were building would last beyond them, that their fingerprints would remain in the seams between stones, even if no one remembered their names. Builders learned to take quiet pride in their skill. The perfect cut, the stable joint, the arch that didn't collapse. It wasn't glory, it wasn't fame, but it was something. Scaffolding was a constant threat. Ancient scaffolds were made of wood, lashed together with rope or leather. Wobbling under weight, they creaked in the wind and buckled under stress. Workers climbed them barefoot or in sandals, carrying buckets of mortar or slabs of brick. One wrong step could mean a fatal fall. There were no safety nets, no warning signs, just your balance and your luck. Time was always the enemy. Pharaohs wanted tombs completed before their deaths. Kings wanted palaces before winter. Rulers demanded speed, size, and spectacle. Corners were cut. Schedules were brutal. Those who couldn't keep up were replaced. The structures were eternal, but the men who built them were painfully mortal. Despite this, builders laughed, they joked, they sang songs, they carved graffiti into hidden corners of temples, they passed tools from hand to hand, they trained younger workers. They watched the sunrise from atop half-finished monuments, sharing bread and silence. They found moments of humanity even in the hardest conditions. And when the last stone was placed, when the temple was consecrated or the arena opened to applause, The workers had long been dismissed. Their job was done. The credit belonged to kings, gods, or architects. The labor belonged to the forgotten, so the next time you walk among ancient ruins or stare up at a colossal stone column, remember this. It did not rise by magic or decree. It rose on the shoulders of men who endured dust, injury, exhaustion, and indifference. Men who lived short, brutal lives to build something that would outlive them all. It's more demanding, more tedious, more fragile, and far less comfortable. To be a scribe was to carry the weight of civilization in your fingertips. Whether carving hieroglyphs into stone, inking cuneiform onto clay, or transcribing law and scripture onto parchment, the scribe served kings, priests, merchants, and myth-makers. They were gatekeepers of bureaucracy, recorders of war, and silent observers of spiritual law. But behind the ink-stained fingers and aching backs was a world of stress, repetition, and intense physical strain. Scribes were essential and invisible all at once. Their work allowed empires to run census rolls, tax receipts, military orders, agricultural records, religious doctrine, legal codes, astronomical tables, but their names rarely appeared in what they wrote. The pharaoh was immortalized, not the man who etched his name into eternity. The law was remembered, not the hands that bent over a table in a smoky, cramped scriptorium to write it. Training to become a scribe began early. In Egypt, boys from elite or priestly families were enrolled in House of Life schools by the age of 5 or 6. There, they learned not just to write, but to memorize hundreds of characters, to calculate using complicated numeral systems, and to recite epic poetry and religious text. Mistakes were punished. Correction was constant. Writing the same sentence over and over again was a common assignment, and if a student failed to show improvement, they were beaten. It was education by repetition, pressure, and pain. Writing wasn't a simple task. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform required pressing wedge-shaped styluses into soft clay tablets. Once dried, the tablet couldn't be changed. Every stroke had to be precise. In Egypt, scribes used brushes made from rushes dipped in carbon-based ink to paint onto papyrus scrolls. In medieval Europe, scribes wrote with quill pens on vellum, stretched calfskins so delicate that a single slip could ruin hours of work. Ink could smear, pens could split, papyrus could tear, and every error mattered. The physical toll was relentless. Scribes sat hunched over rough wooden desks or, in many cases, the floor. They sat for hours in dim light, sunlight through a narrow slit in a stone wall, or the flickering orange of a tallow candle. There was no comfortable chair, no proper table height, no support for the back or neck. Their spines curved unnaturally, their necks stiffened, their eyes strained and dried. Many developed chronic back pain, blurred vision, arthritis in the fingers, and migraines that pulsed behind tired eyes. In some regions, scribes worked in isolation. In others, they shared space with a dozen others, all whispering, reciting, coughing, or groaning softly as they dipped and scratched, dipped and scratched. The silence was intense but never peaceful. A sneeze could ruin a line. A dropped quill could smudge an entire page. There were no digital backups. If your ink spilled, you started again. Distractions were frequent, yet inescapable. In temples, the scent of incense mingled with sweat and mildew. In monasteries, bells rang throughout. The day for prayer regardless of how deep into transcription a scribe was. In royal palaces, scribes were summoned mid-task to record proclamations or dictate letters. Their work was never done. Their tasks were never truly finished. There was always more to write, more to copy, more to preserve. And the workload was monumental. Scribes copied entire books by hand, word for word, letter for letter, often with no understanding of the content itself. Some worked on religious texts, carefully illuminating capital letters with gold leaf and pigments made from crushed beetles or semi-precious stones. Others recorded lists, inventories of grain, births, taxes owed by villagers, maps of the stars. Many transcribed from crumbling originals, decoding unclear letters, interpreting faded lines and hoping they guessed right. The pressure to be perfect was intense. In Jewish tradition, scribes known as sopherim had to follow hundreds of rules. When copying the Torah, a single mistake could invalidate the entire scroll. In medieval monasteries, an error in scripture could lead to punishment or at least humiliation. In China, scribes working on imperial edicts or Confucian texts faced dismissal if they altered even a word. Their job was not to create, but to preserve, not to question, but to replicate. Conditions were often poor. In colder regions, scribes wrapped themselves in wool cloaks, fingers numb as they scratched at vellum. In hotter climates, sweat soaked their garments, and ink ran in the humidity. Rats skittered underfoot. Dust clung to scrolls. Insects chewed the corners of books. Mice nested in shelves. Mold grew in damp rooms. Preservation was a daily fight against nature. Despite their education, many scribes lived modest lives. They were respected but not rich. Their homes were small. Their meals were simple: bread, lentils, olives, or a bit of cheese if available. In monasteries, food was rationed and bland. In court, food was abundant but not always shared with those in the scriptorium. A scribe might spend 10 years copying a single religious manuscript, only to be remembered as a line in the colophon, or not remembered at all. Women, in some cultures, also became scribes. In Mesopotamia, some female scribes worked in temples and handled administrative documents. In medieval Europe, nuns in convents copied scripture, composed hymns, and even created illuminated manuscripts. But like their male counterparts, their names were rarely recorded. Their work passed into history unsigned, uncelebrated, yet essential. Over time, scribes became bureaucrats. In the Roman Empire, scribes managed tax records and legal scrolls. In the Abbasid Caliphate, they preserved Greek philosophy by translating it into Arabic. In India, they maintained family genealogies and temple donations. In Mesoamerica, scribes painted glyphs that recounted dynastic history, cosmology, and prophecy, only for many of those books to be destroyed in conquest. Even in peace, the job was dangerous to the mind. Some scribes wrote of hallucinations, of seeing letters dance on the page, of going temporarily blind. Others described dreams filled with endless lines, repeating letters, or hearing the words they had written echo in their heads long after. Nightfall. Writing all day, reading all night, the line between what was real and what was recorded began to blur. Despite the strain, some found meaning. They hid personal notes in the margins. "Pray for me," one monk wrote in the corner of a gospel. "This work is tedious." Another scribbled, "Thank God it is finished," beneath the final word. A third joked, "The ink is thin, The pen is dull, the parchment is rough, the scribe is tired. These quiet human moments survived when their names did not. And when the scribe finally passed away, the books lived on, their fingerprints hidden beneath ink, their corrections masked under careful overwriting, their labor preserved in every neat line, every repeated phrase, every faithfully copied page. They didn't seek fame, they sought permanence. To write, something that lasted longer than themselves, and in many cases they succeeded. So the next time you read a translated epic, quote an ancient law, or marvel at a sacred manuscript, remember, someone hunched over a table, in silence, in pain, in devotion, made that possible, line by line, word by word. Ink, Eyestrain, and endless scrolls. Chapter 4. The miner's misery, dust, darkness, and death below. Ground when we speak of the ancient world, we often imagine pyramids, temples, empires, and palaces bathed in sunlight. But beneath that surface, sometimes far beneath, another world existed. A world carved out by hand, one stone at a time, where men vanished into shafts and tunnels that groaned with pressure and breathed dust. This was the world of the miner. Long before the invention of dynamite or drilling equipment, the raw materials that fueled civilization, gold, silver, copper, tin, lead, and salt, were ripped from the earth by people with little more than picks, baskets, and torches. Their names were rarely known, their stories rarely told. Yet it was their labor, deep in the suffocating dark, that gave kings their crowns, soldiers their swords, and cities their walls. To be a miner in antiquity was not just hard, it was hazardous in every imaginable way. It was to live surrounded by rock, trapped in silence, breathing particles that tore at your lungs, swinging tools that bruised your bones, and descending each day into a place you might not return from. The day of an ancient miner began early, sometimes before sunrise, especially in hot climates where surface work became unbearable by midday. In many cases, miners lived in camps near the mines, sometimes in temporary shelters or huts built from scrap wood and stone. In regions like ancient Anatolia, Roman Britain, and Egypt, miners often slept communally, their cots laid out shoulder to shoulder in cramped rooms that reeked of sweat, smoke, and sulfur. Food was minimal: bread, onions, lentils, and sometimes fish or dried meat. Water was often fetched from miles away, carried in skins or jars, and never enough. Many miners supplemented their diet with whatever they could grow in sparse gardens, or with rations provided by their overseers, especially in mines run by states or temples. Then came the descent. Mine shafts were narrow, often no more than shoulder width, and sometimes hundreds of feet deep. There were no elevators, no rails. Miners climbed down using rope ladders, notched footholds, or simply slid down the shaft, pressing their limbs against the walls to control their speed. The descent was terrifying. Torches flickered. Rocks shifted. The deeper you went, the more the air thickened. In Egyptian gold mines in the eastern desert, workers carved winding passageways into quartz, veins crawling through shafts barely large enough to squeeze through. In Lorion, near Athens, the silver mines that funded the Athenian navy were filled with enslaved laborers, many of them children, who crawled on hands and knees for hours, pulling out ore with blunt chisels. Roman lead mines in Spain stretched, for miles underground. And in the ancient Andes, miners harvested salt and precious metals from mountains so high that altitude sickness was a daily battle. Inside the mine, the air was humid and still. There was no ventilation system. Fires and torches consumed oxygen. Dust floated constantly, catching in nostrils and throats. Conversations were kept brief, both to conserve breath and avoid triggering echoes that could disturb unstable rock. Tools were primitive and brutal. Iron or bronze picks, hammers, wooden wedges, baskets for carrying ore. Miners worked in teams, one breaking stone, another hauling, another stacking. In copper and tin mines, miners often used fire setting, a technique in which fire was lit against a rock face to heat it, followed by splashing cold water to make it crack. This worked, but filled the tunnels with smoke and steam, often scalding the workers. In salt mines, the very air was corrosive. The skin on hands would peel, eyes would sting, and lips would crack from constant contact with crystal dust. Injury was common. A misjudged swing could break a wrist or crush a finger. Falling rock could maim or kill. Collapses happened frequently. The earth moaned before it gave way, sometimes in time, sometimes not. Those lucky enough to survive a cave-in might be buried waist-deep in rubble, bones shattered, lungs struggling. Death was silent and swift, or slow and inevitable. Falls, crushings, or lung failure claimed most. Ancient texts rarely mention miners directly, but archaeological digs at mining camps reveal their reality. Bodies buried hastily, their bones marked by repetitive stress, arthritis, and healed fractures. And then there was the lung, the miner's curse. Long before modern medicine understood the dangers of airborne particles, miners inhaled deadly dust every day. Silica from stone, lead and copper dust, salt crystals, arsenic vapor. These particles sliced into the lining of the lungs, causing chronic coughing, wheezing, and a slow suffocation that might take years or just weeks. Many miners developed what we now recognize as silicosis, though they had no name for it then, only the knowledge that over time their breath grew shorter and the pain in their chest never left. Miners rarely received medical treatment. Those working for state-run operations might be seen by rudimentary healers, offering poultices, herbal salves, or crude surgeries. But for most, an injury meant dismissal, a blind eye, a scar, and a limp for life. And if you could no longer carry your share, you were no longer useful. Slavery was deeply intertwined with mining. In classical Greece and Rome, vast mining operations relied almost entirely on enslaved labor. In Athens, enslaved people in Lorien worked under armed guard, bound to endless shifts in absolute darkness. Many were prisoners of war, criminals, or simply purchased for the task. They worked until they died, then were replaced. No ceremony, no names. Even in societies that didn't use slaves, miners were expendable. In medieval Europe, free miners were often bound to contracts they couldn't escape, indebted to landowners, paying fees to the crown, and constantly taxed on what they pulled from the ground. In China's Han Dynasty, state-run mines conscripted peasants to work in rotations, often with deadly consequences. In the Incan Empire, Mita laborers worked mountain mines for months on end as part of their civic duty, sometimes never returning. And yet, without these men, many of them boys, civilizations would have stalled. There would be no Bronze Age. Without tin, no empire without silver, no weapons without copper, no currency without gold, no salt to preserve food, no lead to line aqueducts, no mercury for alchemy. The miners' pain funded progress. Above ground, their absence was constant. Miners spent weeks, sometimes months, away from home. Their families lived in worry. Wives raised children alone. Death notices rarely came. Sometimes a man simply didn't return. Rumors passed between workers. A collapse here, a fever outbreak there, an accident that took 3 or 10. Word traveled slowly. Grief moved quietly. But still the mines needed workers. When one died, another stepped in. Fathers trained sons. Older boys took the place of their elders. Communities formed around mines. Towns rose near quarries. Entire local economies depended on what could be pulled from beneath the soil. Miners developed rituals to cope. Offerings left at tunnel mouths, charms tied around necks. In parts of ancient Europe, miners whispered to knockers, spirits believed to live in the rock, warning of danger. In South America, miners left coca leaves or cigarettes at altars inside the mine, hoping the El Tío, the spirit of the mountain, would keep the walls from caving in. Superstition offered the only control in a place where control didn't exist. Sometimes miners left marks, etchings on tunnel walls, names carved into stone, stick figures, symbols of tools, prayers. They left graffiti behind as if to say, I was here, I mattered. Most of these inscriptions were never seen again. The mines closed, the tunnels filled, the darkness swallowed their traces, and when they died, most miners were buried without gravestones. Some were interred near the mine, others dumped into common pits. Bones crushed, teeth worn down, skulls scarred by falling tools. Archaeologists find their remains and piece together their stories, spines compressed, hips twisted, limbs showing, signs of healed breaks and permanent injuries. These were men who worked past pain, who worked until the end. So the next time you see a glittering coin, a smooth copper basin, a delicate gold necklace, or an ancient silver ingot, remember where it came from. And more importantly, remember who it came from. A man who stepped into the dark, who risked his life for metal, who dug deep into the earth so civilization could rise above it. He did not live in luxury. He did not live long. But he made history possible. Chapter 5. The Soldier's Suffering. Blood, boots and battle scars war has shaped civilizations for as long as humans have walked the earth. Borders have shifted, empires have risen, and kings have claimed glory. Almost always on the backs of soldiers. But behind every flag planted, every fortress built, every march of victory recorded in dusty scrolls, there was a man, barely fed, poorly clothed, aching, bleeding, frightened, and often forgotten. To be a soldier in the ancient world was not to wear polished armor and bask in patriotic glory. It was to carry your life on your back and gamble it daily. It was to wake in wet soil and sleep under stars that gave no warmth, to march blistered and hungry, to kill on command and die, sometimes anonymously, in the mud of lands that were never yours. From the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the frozen frontiers of Germania, from the deserts of Egypt to the craggy highlands of Peru, soldiers endured a life of unimaginable hardship. Some were volunteers. Most were not. Many were conscripted, plucked from farms, from tribes, from prisons. In many societies, military service was an obligation, not an opportunity. a rite of passage for some, a death sentence for others. Training was brutal. In Sparta, boys were taken from their mothers at the age of 7, molded into warriors through years of beatings, starvation, and forced competition. In Rome, recruits trained by marching over 20 miles a day in full gear, digging trenches, building camps and sparring, with wooden weapons heavier than the real thing. Chinese conscripts drilled in bow and spear techniques, often on poor rations under watchful commanders, and in many cases training never stopped. War was always on the horizon. Discipline was harsh. In Rome, disobedience could mean decimation, where every 10th man in a cohort was beaten to death by his comrades. In other cultures, cowardice was punished by exile, mutilation, or forced suicide. Orders were followed not because of patriotism, but because refusal meant death. And in the confusion of battle, following orders could still mean death. The gear of a soldier varied: leather or iron armor, a wooden shield, a spear or sword, a bronze helmet that pressed against your temples, sandals or boots that rubbed raw, spots into your feet, a belt with a pouch for dried meat, sometimes a flask for water. Many soldiers carried their own rations, their own tools, and even their own stakes for building nightly camp defenses. The modern concept of supply chains barely existed. You carried what you needed, or you did without. Marching was endless. Soldiers might be ordered to travel for weeks across uneven terrain, mountains, swamps, deserts, forests. There were no paved roads in most places, and even the famed Roman roads were hard and unkind to bare or barely protected feet. Feet blistered, knees swelled, backs stiffened. The packs were heavy, often 60 pounds or more, and shifts in weather brought misery. Rain made armor rust, sun baked helmets into the skin, cold froze fingers around weapon hilts. Camp life was no rest. Every night soldiers had to build fortifications, digging ditches, setting up palisades, sharpening stakes. Shifts were assigned for guard duty. Sleep was short and light. Meals were simple and repetitive. Grain porridge, dried meat, hard bread. Food spoiled easily. Water grew warm and stagnant. Sanitation was minimal. Illness spread quickly in close quarters. Dysentery, lice, foot rot, respiratory infections, all were common, and then there was combat. Real ancient combat was not clean, not cinematic. It was close, dirty, deafening. Spears shattered, shields splintered, swords lodged in ribs or cleaved into thighs. There were no antibiotics, no triage. Arrows whistled through the air, often unseen until they landed. You didn't know where the next strike would come from. You just hoped it didn't come from behind. The fear of being surrounded, of being trampled by horses, of being forgotten in the rush, this fear never left a soldier, even off the battlefield. In Greek phalanx formations, men pressed shoulder to shoulder, forming walls of shields and spears. If the man next to you fell, your side weakened. If you fell, you hoped someone noticed. Roman soldiers fought in disciplined ranks, but chaos still crept in. In hand-to-hand combat, everything became personal, the weight of a body collapsing. Against you, the screams, the blood, the slick grass beneath your sandals. Wounds were not clean. A gash from a bronze sword could sever muscle or slice tendons. Arrowheads embedded in joints, javelins shattered bones. Medical care, if it existed, was primitive. A soldier might have his wound washed with vinegar or cauterized with hot metal. Limbs were amputated with dull blades. Death from infection was common. A cut that didn't kill you outright might still end your life slowly. Psychological trauma was real, though not recognized. Men came back changed, quiet, aggressive, or shattered. Some broke in the middle of battle, dropping weapons and fleeing. Others relived their fights in dreams. There were no words for post-traumatic stress. You were simply told to be strong, to return to duty, to march again. In siege warfare, the suffering intensified. Soldiers built siege engines under arrow fire. They scaled walls while boiling oil was poured from above. They tunneled under fortifications, only to be buried alive when tunnels collapsed. In return, when cities fell, the bloodshed was indiscriminate. Soldiers were allowed to loot, to kill, to do what they wished, for a time. This was their payment, their reward. And many regretted it. Some didn't. Not all soldiers fought for glory. Many were forced, prisoners conscripted, debtors, slaves, peasants who could not afford to bribe their way out. In medieval Japan, ashigaru foot soldiers were often poor farmers given a spear and a command. In ancient China, entire villages were required to provide troops for state campaigns. In the Incan Empire, warriors were drawn from conquered peoples. Some never spoke the language of their generals. They fought anyway. Religious justifications added pressure. Soldiers were told they fought for gods, for honor, for the dead, for destiny. Sacred banners flew above columns. Priests offered blessings. Diviners read omens before battles. If signs were poor, men grew fearful. If signs were good, they marched forward, only to fall the same. Letters home, if they existed, were few. Most soldiers couldn't write. News from family came rarely, if at all. A soldier might fight for years in foreign lands, never knowing if his wife had died, his child been born, his village burned. Grief was carried quietly, buried deep like a sword wound. Death came not just in battle, it came in boredom, in disease, in punishment, in hunger. A man could march for a year and never swing his sword, only to collapse from fever or be executed for falling asleep on watch. Mass graves tell these stories, rows of bones, some with blade marks, others with no sign of battle at all. Just bodies laid down, one after another, forgotten by the living, remembered only by the land. And when a soldier finally returned, if he returned, he often found no welcome. His farm taken, his body broken, his heart restless. He was too changed to return to old routines. The skills he had, killing, marching, surviving, were not useful in peacetime. Some became mercenaries, some drank, some disappeared. Still new soldiers rose to take their place, because someone always had to. Kings needed armies, nobles needed protection. Trade routes needed guarding. Borders needed watching. The machine of war never stopped, and someone had to bleed to keep it running. So when you read about battles won, territories claimed, nations born, remember who paid the price: the soldier. The one who marched in mud, slept on stone, bled into grass, and carried the world's wars on weary shoulders. He did not choose his fate, but he fulfilled it. Chapter 6. The servant's struggle. Chains, chores, and constant demands. Not every person in the ancient world was a soldier, miner, or builder. Some lived in grand palaces, others in tiny huts. But in between, scattered like dust across history, were the invisible hands that scrubbed, fetched, swept, cooked, carried, and obeyed without question. They were the servants, bound by duty, hierarchy, or outright force. The lives they lived were not their own. Their days were long, their tasks relentless, and their dignity, when acknowledged at all, was always conditional. Servants were everywhere in the ancient world. In Egypt, they ran the homes of the elite and toiled in temples. In Greece, they managed meals, tended fires, and accompanied children. In Rome, they were slaves, often indistinguishable from property, used not just in houses, but in every part of public life, from bathhouses to bakeries. In dynastic China, domestic servants labored under Confucian orders of strict obedience. In India, caste and class determined what kind of service you gave, and how little you could expect in return. Some were born into service. Others were captured in war or sold by desperate families. Some were punished into servitude through debt or crime. A few offered themselves willingly, trading their freedom for food and shelter, but regardless of how they arrived, most never left. For many, a life of service was not a stepping stone. It was the final destination. The duties of a servant were endless. In noble homes, mornings began before the sun. Fires had to be relit, beds made, floors swept, laundry fetched, washed, beaten on rocks and hung out to dry. Meals were prepared from scratch, grains ground, herbs cut, animals slaughtered and cleaned by hand. Servants stirred pots for hours, baked bread in clay ovens, and poured wine at the table while standing silently beside their masters. If their master rose early, they rose earlier. If their master wanted a midnight snack, they did not sleep. If the children were loud, they were expected to soothe them. If guests arrived unannounced, the house was cleaned again, the fires stoked, the dishes reset. There was no such thing as "not my job." Servants walked miles each day between kitchens and gardens, rooms and wells, markets and temples. They carried baskets of produce, amphorae of wine, bolts of cloth, and sometimes even their employers themselves in litters or chairs. Many wore simple tunics, short and coarse, never warm enough in winter, never breathable enough in summer. Some went barefoot, others wore shoes too thin to matter. The work was both physical and emotional. To serve meant to vanish, to exist only when needed, to be polite when insulted, to stay calm when blamed, to smile when tired. Many servants were struck for mistakes, shouted at for delays, dismissed with a wave, or ignored for days. They were expected to remember every preference, anticipate every need, and never raise their voice in complaint. Some households had strict schedules. In Roman villas, larger homes had dozens of enslaved servants, each with a precise duty. One to care for lamps, another to dress the mistress, one to sweep the atrium, another to open the door. Those who failed in their tasks could be punished publicly or privately, beaten, denied meals, or reassigned to harsher labor. Others worked in tighter quarters. A single servant might manage every task in a modest home, collecting firewood, tending livestock, cooking, cleaning, sewing, and assisting at the market. In many cultures, female servants were tasked with both domestic chores and intimate ones, bathing their mistresses, massaging their masters, and sometimes bearing their children. Their sleep was broken and light. Servants slept on mats, near doors, or in corners of kitchens. They kept one ear open in case they were summoned. Candles flickered throughout the night. Babies cried. Guests stumbled in. Fires needed tending. Privacy was non-existent. And if they overslept, they risked punishment. Even in temples and sacred households, servants bore no privilege. Those who swept temple floors, carried water for rituals, or cleaned sacrificial altars were not honored for their role in the sacred. They were overlooked. In many cases, their only reward was that they were allowed to remain near the divine, even as they scrubbed away blood and ash. The dangers of service were subtle but constant. Burned hands from hearths, crushed fingers from doorframes, broken backs from hauling amphorae, lungs damaged by smoke from kitchens, parasites from contaminated food, cuts and bruises from rough treatment, and perhaps most insidious of all, lifelong weariness from being constantly useful, never at rest. Children born to servants often followed in their parents' footsteps. Some were trained early, girls learning to weave and wash, boys learning to chop wood and fetch water. In wealthier households, child servants were assigned to child masters. Their job was to entertain, assist, or obey the whims of their young superior. Sometimes they formed bonds. Often they learned quickly that friendship did not erase the difference in status. In some cultures, servants could earn manumission, release from bondage, through years of loyalty or specific acts of service. In Rome, some freedmen became prosperous, but these cases were rare. More often, a lifetime of labor was followed by abandonment in old age or a quiet death in the same household they had served since youth. Religion and philosophy often justified the servant's role. In India, the caste system assigned service as a sacred duty. In ancient Greece, some philosophers claimed that certain people were natural slaves, suited only to follow. In medieval Europe, Christian sermons preached humility and the value of labor, urging servants to accept their lot for heavenly reward. These teachings comforted the powerful far more than they comforted the people below. And yet within the boundaries of servitude, moments of agency appeared. Servants passed information between households. They overheard secrets, witnessed scandals, and sometimes leveraged what they knew for better conditions. Some acted as matchmakers, smugglers, or spies. Some escaped. Some revolted. Most did not. But they had stories. A servant who saved a master's life during illness. Another who raised generations of children with more care than their own parents. A cook who preserved recipes for centuries. A maid whose embroidered handiwork still adorns artifacts in museums today. Their hands are on every part of history, but their names more often than not are lost. Burial for servants was as modest as their lives. If buried at all, it was in communal plots, shallow graves, or unmarked earth outside the city. No epitaph. No statue. Just the final silence after a lifetime of being told to speak softly and walk quickly. And yet it was these people, the overlooked, the overworked, the obedient and unseen, who allowed civilization to move. While kings schemed, soldiers fought, and merchants traded, it was the servant who lit the hearth, swept the floor, drew the bath, packed the bag, and locked the door. Every comfort enjoyed by the powerful was bought, not in gold, but in the toil of someone they never truly saw. So when you walk through the ruins of a palace, admire the detail of an ancient scroll, or study the rituals of distant faiths, Remember that someone prepared that place, someone fetched that ink, someone laid the stones and cleaned the floors, not for credit, not for honor, but because they were told to. And though history rarely carved their stories into monuments, the world they built was real, one pot washed, one floor swept, one burden carried, again and again and again. Chapter 7. The Apprentice's Agony, Lessons, Labour and Life at the Bottom History often remembers the masters, the inventors, the craftsmen, the guild leaders, the visionaries who signed their names into legend. But behind every master, there was once a trembling apprentice, a boy or girl handed over to a stranger, told to listen, to learn, and above all else to obey. Apprenticeship in the ancient and medieval world was not a student's journey of discovery. It was a long, grinding climb up the steepest ladder society could offer. And for many, it was a climb that ended where it began, at the bottom. To become an apprentice was often to lose your childhood. In Europe's Middle Ages, children as young as 7 were sent away from their homes to live under the roofs of blacksmiths, carpenters, cobblers, or weavers. Parents gave them over with hope, not for comfort or education, but for survival. A skilled trade meant the possibility of work. It meant food, a roof, and the thin chance of social advancement. But first came years of toil. An apprentice did not begin with tools in hand. They began with a broom, with fetching water, with sweeping floors. Their first lessons were in silence, obedience, and endurance. They learned to wake before dawn, stoke fires, scrub benches, carry heavy loads, and wait. Only after months, or years, were they trusted with the tools of the trade. Before a boy learned to shape steel, he learned to clean ashes from the forge. Before a girl learned to spin silk, she untangled wool and gathered reeds. In ancient Egypt, apprentices in temple workshops began as runners and errand boys. In classical China, artisans' sons were trained by watching silently, sometimes for years before being allowed to practice calligraphy or ceramics. In medieval Europe, a young apprentice lived under his master's roof, often sleeping on a straw mat in the shop or attic, working 7 days a week. There were no weekends, no holidays. The work was repetitive and physically exhausting. Apprentices stood for hours, their bodies bent and strained in awkward positions, kneeling on stone floors, hauling barrels, turning grindstones by hand. They developed calluses before they knew the trade. Many suffered burns, cuts, or fractures within their first years. Tools slipped, forges flared, blades bit fingers. There was little pity and less protection, and then came the learning itself, by rote, by watching, by failing. In scribal schools, apprentices copied letters for hours until their wrists throbbed. In apothecary shops, they memorized long lists of herbs, some poisonous, some vital. In stonemasonry, they hauled blocks and traced blueprints they were not allowed to question. Knowledge was not handed out. It was earned through patience, humiliation, and repetition. Discipline was harsh. A master might shout, strike, or starve a pupil who disobeyed or erred. In some guilds, apprentices signed binding contracts that allowed their masters to punish them physically. Whippings were not uncommon. A disrespectful tone could lead to weeks of extra chores. Mistakes were corrected with scorn. And yet apprentices stayed because they had no choice. The world outside the workshop offered less. In many places, apprentices were not paid. They were fed, barely, clothed in cast-offs, Given leftovers from the master's meals, their value was in their labor, and only in the final years of their apprenticeship might they be given a coin or two for extra work. Some were required to buy their own tools before graduating. Those without savings or family support often remained bound long past their expected term. The relationship between master and apprentice was not always cruel, but it was rarely equal. Some masters treated their apprentices like family, teaching them with patience, feeding them well, offering praise when due. Others exploited them, using their labor with little thought for the boy or girl behind the hands. In abusive homes, apprentices were little more than indentured servants. In generous homes, they were simply the lowest in a rigid chain of command. Apprenticeships lasted years. In many medieval guilds, 7 years was standard. 7 years of cleaning, practicing, failing, and beginning again, only after completing this term and presenting a masterpiece, a final project proving their skill, could an apprentice hope to become a journeyman. And even then the journey had only just begun. Journeymen travelled. They sought work from town to town, carrying letters of recommendation from their masters. They offered their skills for hire, still under the authority of guild rules. A journeyman might spend another decade in this liminal state, good enough to work, not trusted enough to lead. The title of master remained distant. Only those with money, contacts, or extraordinary talent could rise further. Most remained journeymen until their hands gave out, and yet apprentices were the quiet engines of progress. It was they who heated the forge, spun the wheel, ground the grain, copied the scrolls. They stitched the hems, they turned the screws. They beat the drumskins, swept the sawdust, and boiled the glue. Without them, masters were nothing. Their lives were shaped not only by work, but by the world around it. In times of plague, apprentices tended sick masters or buried their own peers. In times of war, some were conscripted to build, to fight, or to die. In prosperous times, they were exploited harder, pushed to meet demand. In poor times, they were let go, turned out with no savings and no place to go. Women, too, were apprentices, though history hides them well. In textile shops, apothecaries, bakeries, and midwife guilds, young girls learned trades from mothers, aunts, or older women. Their work was as hard and their hours as long, but their paths were narrower. Even after years of apprenticeship, few could hold official titles. Many were expected to marry or remain in the shadow of a male relative's name. Some apprentices became famous. Leonardo da Vinci once apprenticed to a painter in Florence. Others left no trace. Their work remains: stained glass windows, carved doorways, iron tools, lace collars, sturdy saddles. But the names behind them vanished. They were not inscribed in stone, only their fingerprints, invisible in wood grain or brushstroke, remain. The apprentice rarely found ease. Their backs hunched early, their fingers twisted from strain, their eyes dimmed from candlelight. By the time they reached adulthood, many were already worn, but they were steady and resilient and relentless. So when you admire an illuminated manuscript, a cathedral column, a delicate silver brooch, or the perfect arch of a forgotten bridge, remember the apprentice, the one who worked in silence, who fetched and carried and waited, who learned through pain, and who, for a moment in history, held the future in their tired hands. Chapter 8. The Sailor's Sentence. Storms, Salt, and Servitude. At sea to live by the sea was one thing. To live on it was another. In the ancient, world, sailors were not adventurers chasing glory or cartographers drawing maps of the unknown. They were laborers, drifters, prisoners of wind and tide. Their lives were long stretches of danger, broken by moments of terror, shaped by salt, sweat, and suffering. Before engines, before navigation systems, before any guarantee of return, men climbed aboard wooden vessels held together by rope, pitch, and hope. These ships crossed rivers, hugged coasts, or struck out into open oceans on journeys that might last months, or end in days. Whether trading grain on the Nile, ferrying tribute across the Aegean, waging war from Phoenician triremes, or fishing from the Chinese coast, the sailor's life was hard, hazardous, and profoundly humbling. Most sailors did not volunteer. They were conscripted, sentenced, or forced by circumstance. In many societies, maritime service was punishment, assigned to criminals, slaves, or the poor. In Athens, naval rowers were drawn from the lowest classes. In Rome, naval service was often a form of penal labor. Even in later centuries, press gangs dragged men from taverns or farms and forced them aboard ships. Once aboard, there was no turning back. The sea did not negotiate. A sailor's day began with the sun, if it ever ended. Sleep came in shifts, snatched between storms and duties. Hammocks were a luxury. Most slept on coiled ropes, damp boards, or beside barrels. The smell was constant: salt, sweat, fish, bilge water, rot. Food was hard biscuits riddled with weevils, dried meat, and whatever could be caught or preserved. Water was stored in barrels and turned foul quickly. Wine or beer diluted with seawater was sometimes safer to drink. Clothing was simple: coarse tunics, oiled cloaks, straw sandals, or bare feet. Salt air corroded everything: metal, cloth, skin. Sailors developed cracked
hands, peeling lips, and sores that never healed.
Eyes burned from the glare off the water. The wind chapped their cheeks. Wet clothes stuck to their bodies day and night. Work never stopped. Sails had to be hoisted and lowered, ropes coiled, decks scrubbed, cargo loaded and lashed, leaks patched, with resin and prayer. If a storm was coming, sails were reefed. If oars were needed, men rowed. Sometimes for hours, sometimes in rhythm to a beating drum, sometimes in silence, teeth clenched against cramping muscles and raw palms. The risk of drowning was constant. Few sailors could swim. If you fell overboard, you disappeared, dragged by current, lost to waves. Rescue was rare and dangerous. Lightning struck masts, waves snapped rudders, whirlpools pulled ships into the depths. In stormy seas, ships capsized with terrifying speed. Men screamed, prayed, vomited, and clung to anything that floated. Disease thrived at sea. Scurvy, caused by vitamin deficiency, rotted teeth and blackened gums. Dysentery spread through shared bowls and contaminated water. Infected wounds festered. Rats ran freely. Lice nested in beards and hair. Fevers killed slowly, the heat of the body rising while the cold of the sea pressed all around. Punishment was brutal. Sailors who disobeyed were flogged, starved, or locked in chains. In some navies, lashings were administered publicly. In others, the guilty were tied to the mast. Mutiny meant death. Desertion meant branding, or worse. On merchant ships, captains held absolute authority. On military vessels, commanders could execute without trial. Navigation was imprecise. Mariners used stars, sun, and shoreline to steer. They measured depth with ropes and stones. They relied on memory and myth. In cloudy weather, they drifted. In strange waters, they guessed. Currents changed suddenly. Sandbars appeared like ghosts. The world map was not yet drawn. Every journey was an experiment. Fear accompanied them always, of pirates who might board, kill, or enslave, of sea monsters imagined or misidentified, of enemy navies whose triremes or longships bore death on sharpened prows, of being blown off course, stranded on barren islands, or swallowed by tempests. And yet the sailor was expected to endure. Rowers, especially in warships, suffered most. In galleys, men chained to benches rowed in unison, their bodies breaking under repetition. Slaves, convicts, and sometimes free men shared the same fate. They rowed in darkness, in heat, in thirst. They rowed until they collapsed. And if they'd died, they were thrown overboard. In fishing boats, the dangers were quieter but constant. Nets tangled around legs, hooks pierced fingers, storms came suddenly, the boat leaked, the catch spoiled, and even when the fish were plentiful, merchants. In trade ships, long voyages meant longer boredom. Days passed in monotony, punctuated by terror. Shipwrecks were common. So were raids. Goods spoiled in damp holds. Wooden barrels burst in heat. Animals died in transit. And when blame was cast, the sailor stood nearest. Still, they found moments of peace. Sunrises on calm seas, a breeze after long stillness, songs shared in rhythm, stories told under stars, bonds forged in sweat and salt. Superstitions grew, coins nailed to masts for luck, tattoos for protection, whispers to the sea goddess. The ocean took much. Sailors begged it to take no more. When they returned, if they returned, sailors were rarely greeted with glory. Some found no home to return to. Others spent their earnings in days. Few had savings. Many went back to sea, not out of love, but necessity. The land had no place for them anymore. Their legs felt strange on still ground. Their hearts still drifted. And when they died, it was often far from home, buried in foreign soil, or slip beneath the waves, a splash, a prayer, a moment of silence. Then the ship moved on. So when you think of the ancient world's conquests and commerce, when you picture spices on distant tables or emperors surveying distant coasts, remember the sailor, not the captain, not the explorer, but the man with blistered hands, aching arms, and salt on his tongue, the man who knew the sea better than he knew comfort, the man who gave everything and asked for nothing. Because history's ships did not sail on courage alone, they sailed on backs bent by the wind and hearts hardened by waves. Chapter 9. The Washer's Woe, Water, Wringer, and Worn Hands. In the long sweep of history, the spotlight falls most often on warriors, kings, and priests. But civilization also depended on quieter hands, hands soaked in water, chapped by soap, stained with ash. These were the hands of the washers, the launderers, the silent workers who scrubbed, rinsed, and wrung fabric clean in an age before detergent, plumbing, or rest. To wash clothes in the ancient world was to wrestle daily with sweat, stink, and endless repetition. This was not laundry as we know it. It was a grueling process, often carried out by the lowest members of society, servants, enslaved people, or the desperately poor. And despite the hard labor, the washers' name was rarely known. They labored in alleyways, rivers, yards, and open basins, yet their work was invisible until it went undone. Every garment worn by nobles, soldiers, scribes, or peasants eventually made its way to someone who had to clean it. In ancient Rome, tunics and togas were sent to Fuloniki, commercial laundries operated by workers called fullers. These laundries were hot, stinking places where urine was collected in jars and used as a cleansing agent. Yes, human urine, full of ammonia, helped dissolve oils and dirt. Fullers stomped on clothes barefoot in vats of this solution, then beat the cloth with paddles or stones, scrubbed it with clay, and finally rinsed it with water, drawn by hand. In other parts of the world, the process was no less punishing. In India, dhobis, professional washer families, spent their lives cleaning garments in riverbanks. Each piece was soaked, beaten against a stone slab, and then rinsed in often contaminated water. Their hands blistered from lye, their backs bent under baskets of wet fabric. The sun dried the garments, the wind sometimes stole them, and all the while the next batch piled up behind them. Washerwomen in medieval Europe bore much of the burden. They rose before dawn, hauling buckets to the nearest stream or well. Clothes were boiled in cauldrons over open flames, stirred with wooden paddles. Ashes from the hearth were mixed with water to form lye. The mixture burned the skin, stung the eyes, and left cuts vulnerable to infection. The water was heavy. A bucket could weigh over 40 pounds, and the process repeated every week or even daily in homes where nobility changed clothes several times a day. Hands were never dry, skin never healed, nails cracked, knuckles split. The air stank of damp cloth, mildew, and sweat. In some climates, water froze on fingers before garments could be rinsed. In others, the heat caused rashes, mold, and constant thirst. There were no gloves, no aprons, no relief. And the work wasn't just physical, it was social. Washers were often blamed for ruined clothing, even when the fault lay in poor fabric or old dye. If a noble's tunic faded, the washer was whipped. If a soldier's cloak stiffened or shrank, the washer was docked wages. In some cultures, particularly in caste-based societies, launderers were considered unclean by nature. They were kept separate, denied entry to temples, forbidden to touch food or water vessels of higher castes. Some washerwomen doubled as midwives or caretakers, their skills undervalued and unpaid. Others raised children while working, balancing, baskets on their heads and infants on their backs. Their own clothes were rarely clean. They went without so others could go in white linen and bright silks. Children helped too. They carried water, stirred pots, scrubbed smaller garments. Many began as early as age 6. They learned the rhythm of beating cloth on stone, the weight of wet linen, the difference between oil stains and blood stains, and how to treat both with only what the land provided. Soap, if it existed, was handmade from rendered fat and lye, shaped into crude cakes that stung eyes and cracked skin. Despite the hardship, washers became experts in their craft. They knew which herbs could freshen cloth, how to sun-dry fabric without fading it, how to fold and pleat for transport. In some cities, fullers were respected for their trade, taxed as professionals, and organized into guilds. But even then their work kept them in steaming basins, coughing from fumes, wiping sweat with arms already soaked to the elbow. And still the need for clean linen never stopped. Births, weddings, funerals, feast days, market days, each required freshly pressed garments.